Commander Atara Vir stood on the bridge of the TCS Archeon, her eyes fixed on the holographic display in the center of the room. It showed a stark, chilling image, a gargantuan asteroid, a craggy titan of rock and ice, barreling toward Earth on a catastrophic collision course. Every pulse of its trajectory on the display seemed to beat in time with her racing heart. It had begun a mere 2 cycles ago, a faint signal picked up by one of the deep space telescopes nestled in the asteroid belt. Initially, the readings had been dismissed as an anomaly, a glitch in the system. But as more data streamed in, the chilling truth dawned on the Terran Confederacy: this was no glitch. It was an extinction-level event. How they had missed something this massive was a question that stung the Terran military command like a swarm of venom wasps. Their orbital sensor arrays were the most advanced in the known galaxy. Yet, even accounting for stealth capabilities, a celestial behemoth of such proportions should not have been able to slip by totally undetected. Commander, Lieutenant Terrans Sci, Atara's unflappable communications officer, broke the tense silence on the bridge. Encrypted signal coming in, highest priority from Lunar Command. Patch it through, Atara responded, her voice sharp. A grainy image flickered into existence on the display, replacing the grim trajectory of the asteroid. Admiral Zev Helios, the grizzled and steely-eyed leader of the Terran fleet, stared back at them. Atara noted the drawn lines on her face, the grim set of her jaw. The burden of this crisis seemed to weigh physically upon her. Commander Vir, Lieutenant Sci, the Admiral began, her voice low and laden with urgency. Our xenolinguistics teams have finally cracked it. She paused, the silence heavy as a neutron star. The signal we detected, the one that masked the asteroid's approach, it wasn't a malfunction. It was a deliberate transmission. A wave of shock washed over the bridge. Atara felt a cold dread coil in her stomach. The Maldorians. Terrain breathed, the name hanging in the air like a curse. The Maldorians were their oldest and most formidable rivals. A reptilian species known for their cunning ruthlessness and technological prowess, humanity and the Maldorian Empire had been locked in a cold war ever since their first brutal encounter centuries earlier. The prospect of the Maldorians directing this calamity at Terra filled Atara with a white-hot rage. The transmission was a complex weave of frequencies, the Admiral continued, her face grim. It wasn't meant to communicate, but rather to disrupt our sensor networks, to hide that damned rock. We are certain of its origin. They want us wiped out, Atara growled, her knuckles whitening around the edge of the command console. The cowards. That, Commander, seems to be their intention, the Admiral confirmed. I'm transferring all relevant data to you immediately. Your mission has changed. Her gaze hardened. You will find a way to stop that asteroid, Vir. Earth's fate depends on it. Helios' image flickered out, leaving the bridge of the Archeon in stunned silence. They had been blindsided, hit with the cosmic equivalent of a sucker punch. It was time to fight back. Atara straightened her spine. The TCS Archeon was the pride of the fleet, the culmination of Terran ingenuity and raw power. She was outfitted with experimental weaponry, systems still years away from mass production. Atara was no stranger to wielding the Confederacy's bleeding-edge tech, but the stakes had never been higher. Lieutenant Sci, get me our chief scientists, Dr. Solara Nix and Commander Alara Zhen, she ordered, the first threads of a desperate plan forming in her mind. And prep a fleet-wide transmission. It's time we address the crew. With a newfound grim determination, Atara turned back to the display. The asteroid's projected path seared itself into her mind, a fiery doomsday countdown. Hours later, Atara addressed the entire crew of the Archeon. Hundreds of faces, human, Soren, Kihari, all the diverse species that made up the Terran Confederacy, stared back at her, their expressions ranging from grim stoicism to outright fear. This was not how she would have chosen to announce their potential annihilation, but there was no time for sugarcoating. The hushed silence on the bridge of the Archeon was shattered by the arrival of Dr. Solara Nix, the Confederacy's top theoretical physicist, and Commander Alara Zhen, their brilliant but notoriously unorthodox weapons engineer. Nix, a whirlwind of nervous energy, her wild hair a testament to the sleepless nights she no doubt endured, immediately began projecting a series of complex equations and diagrams onto the holodisplay. Zhen, in stark contrast, carried herself with the studied nonchalance of someone long accustomed to impossibilities. Based on the Maldorian signal matrix and the asteroid's recalculated trajectory, Nix explained, her voice pitched high with tension, it isn't just heading for Earth. It's being actively guided. A ripple of unease passed through the bridge crew. If the asteroid's apocalyptic course was a deliberate act of war, it was infinitely more terrifying. Guided how? Atara pressed, her voice a low growl. Some form of tractor beam technology? Unlikely, Zhen cut in. Her voice was cool, analytical. The power requirements would be staggering. Plus, she added, a hint of dark humor in her tone, that would take some seriously impressive aim over interstellar distances. Then how the hell are they steering that thing? Terrain demanded, echoing the frustration building on the bridge. My theory, Nyx interjected, her eyes wide, is that they aren't targeting Earth directly. A ripple of confusion passed through the bridge. They're targeting something bigger. Something with enough gravity to slingshot that monstrosity our way. Atara's mind raced. You think they're using a celestial body? Jupiter, Zhen confirmed. They're likely utilizing a precise series of micro-explosions or some form of focused energy pulses. They're altering the asteroid's course incrementally, nudging it onto a trajectory that will use Jupiter's immense gravity as a catastrophic slingshot. The implications hit Atara like a physical blow. The Maldorians weren't just aiming a rock at Earth, they were weaponizing a gas giant. The sheer audacity and cunning of the plan was staggering. Calculate a revised impact timeline, she ordered, her voice tight. Nyx's fingers flew across her console. Seconds later, the display updated. The asteroid's arrival date shifted, moving inexorably closer. Every second they spent analyzing the threat was another second lost. We don't have time, Atara said grimly, a new plan forming in her mind. It was risky, reckless even, but fear had been eclipsed by icy resolve. Lieutenant Kai, signal the fleet. New course heading, the Jovian system. The Jovian system, Commander? Kai exclaimed, surprise evident in her voice. But that's deep in Maldorian space. Exactly, Atara responded, a dangerous glint in her eye. We can't stop the asteroid, but maybe we can stop the bastards guiding it. Her orders cut through the tension like a blade. The crew of the Archeon might have been staring down annihilation, but they were Terrans. They wouldn't cower. If this was a fight, they'd bring it to the enemy's doorstep. Dr. Nyx, Commander Zhen, Atara addressed her scientists. With me. We're going to brainstorm how to turn the Archeon into a planet cracker. The rest of you, she looked back at the bridge crew, get this ship ready for war. Hours turned into cycles as the Archeon and her hastily assembled battle group raced towards the Jupiter system on a trajectory deliberately mirroring the asteroids. It was a desperate gamble. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and venturing deep into hostile territory. But sometimes, Atara knew, the only way to fight a monster was to meet it head-on. Exiting hyperspace on the fringes of the Jovian system was like plunging headfirst into a swirling vortex of chaos. The gargantuan gas giant dominated the viewscreen, its tempestuous bands of color both beautiful and terrifying. Surrounding it was a swarm of Maldorian warships, their sleek, predatory forms stark against the swirling backdrop of Jupiter. Well, they weren't expecting company, Terrain quipped, the first sign of tension breaking through her usually unflappable demeanor. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, a thread of Terran defiance ran deep. Dr. Nyx, Atara addressed the physicist, whose face was pale but determined. What's the status of our modifications? Almost there, Commander, Nyx reported, her fingers a blur on her console. We cannibalized components from the auxiliary power systems, rerouted the core energy conduits. Zhen's makeshift focusing array will be best for a single concentrated burst, not sustained fire. Single burst is all we need, Atara affirmed grimly. Helm, as soon as we're in range, I want a direct course for the nearest Maldorian cruiser. All power to forward shields, channel the rest into the primary weapon array. The Archeon surged forward, a lone defiant spark against a starfield of enemies. Maldorian interceptors streaked towards them, spitting laser fire, intent on swatting the Terran fly before it could sting. Evasive maneuvers. Atara barked. The Archeon danced through a storm of energy blasts, her shields groaning under the onslaught. Alarms blared as the ship took glancing hits, but Atara held her course. Commander, engineering reports critical overload in the... Nyx's warning was cut short as the Archeon shuddered violently, a blinding wave of energy washing over the bridge. As the light faded, Atara saw that a swath of interceptor fire had finally breached their defenses, raking the port side of the ship. Damage report, Atara shouted. Hull breach on decks 5 through 8. Non-essential systems offline. Terrain's voice was strained but unwavering. The Archeon was wounded, but they were closing the distance. Through the chaos, Atara could make out the sleek profile of a Maldorian cruiser, its size dwarfing the Terran vessel. We're in range, Nyx exclaimed, a desperate hope flickering in her eyes. Target lock acquired, Zhen added, her voice as cold and steady as if she were calibrating lab instruments, not aiming the most destructive weapon the Terran Confederacy had ever built. Fire! Atara's command echoed through the battered ship. A blinding beam of pure, unfocused energy lanced out from the Archeon, slicing through the void. The targeted Maldorian cruiser never had a chance. The concentrated blast punched through shields, vaporized armor, and ignited the ship's core in a blinding, silent explosion. The shockwave rolled outwards, momentarily dispersing the swirling dogfight. Yet, the Terrans' victory was short-lived. Maldorian warships converged on their position like a hive of enraged insects, weapons blazing. "Commander," Terrain cried out, multiple hostiles inbound on attack vectors. "Shields failing." "Evasive." Atara began, but her order was cut off as multiple explosions rocked the Archeon. Consoles sparked and died, the lights flickered, and finally, the ship plunged into an eerie darkness. On the bridge, Atara felt the deck tilt beneath her feet as the Archeon bled power. Through the swirling smoke and Avarineas Vishenia, she saw the determined faces of her crew. There was fear there, yes, but above all else, there was defiance. They'd gambled everything. Wounded their enemy, disrupted their plan, perhaps even bought precious moments for Earth. Now, it seemed they would pay the ultimate price for their audacity. Yet, Atara Vir, daughter of Terra, had no regrets. It was how her people faced the end, not with whimpers, but with a roar. Atara felt as if she was floating, weightless and disoriented. Her head throbbed, and her ears rang with the fading echoes of explosions. When she tried to open her eyes, the dim red pulse of the emergency lights was almost blinding. It took her a moment to understand that she was pinned upside down, her seat harness the only thing preventing her from crashing to the ceiling, or what was once the ceiling. Groaning, she fumbled with the release mechanism. The buckle snapped open, sending her tumbling to the deck where she landed in a disheveled heap amidst a tangle of sparking wires and fractured consoles. "Vir." A familiar voice broke through the haze in her brain. Terrain kneeled beside her, a gash bleeding on her forehead, but her eyes were sharp with focus. "Commander, are you functional?" Atara rasped, pushing herself up. Her entire body protested, but her mind was racing. "Status. Now." Terrain winced but quickly rattled off their dire situation. "Life support is critical. Main power is offline, auxiliaries are barely keeping it together. Hull integrity. Let's just say we're venting atmosphere. I've got teams trying to seal the breaches, but..." "Weapons?" Atara cut her off. "Gone," Terrain said simply. "What we fired is all we had. The Archeon, she's done, Commander." Atara absorbed the grim assessment. Their gamble had failed. They were a crippled ship, adrift in enemy territory. Yet, despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Can we get comms back online?" "Trying." Terrain's fingers flew over a backup console. "There's heavy interference, something deliberate." Her eyes widened in sudden realization. "Maldorians. They're jamming us." Fury surged through Atara. Even as they floated helplessly, the enemy was tightening the noose. "Engineering. I need a status, yesterday." A crackling voice came over the damaged speakers. "Commander, it's a miracle anything still works down here. We jury-rigged a power tap, but the conduits are, well, let's just say ventilation is the least of our problems." Atara swore under her breath. They were running on fumes, and soon, even those would be gone. "Commander," Dr. Nix's voice cut in, laced with urgency. She'd materialized from the swirling chaos of the bridge, remarkably unscathed given the damage she described. "Listen, about the asteroid, I was wrong." Atara's heart sank. "Wrong how?" "It's not Jupiter," Nix confessed. "They weren't using it like a slingshot. It was a decoy. The Maldorians always were masters of deception." Her voice faltered slightly. "I recalibrated, accounting for the energy bursts they had to use to deflect our blast. True target, it's Io." Understanding dawned on Atara like a fresh wound. Io, the fiery volcanic moon of Jupiter. It was smaller than Earth's moon, but its violent geological activity made it the perfect trigger. "They're going to destabilize it," Atara said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Rupture the core, that kind of catastrophic detonation would send a shockwave back towards Earth with enough energy to shatter our entire planetary crust," Nix finished, the horror evident in her voice. The asteroid had never been the true threat, it was a monstrous distraction. The silence on the bridge was deafening. With Jupiter as a decoy, the Terrans had played directly into the Maldorians' hands. Now, even if they could somehow restart the Archeon, They didn't have the time to reach Io and stop what had been set in motion. Commander Vir to all decks, Atara forced her voice to remain steady. Abandoned ship protocols are in effect. Her words were a death sentence. Escape pods were a last resort, a desperate gamble against the merciless odds of deep space. But it was that, or go down with her ship. And Atara, like every Terran steeped in the defiant history of her people, could never accept that. There had to be another way. Suddenly, a calm signal stuttered into life. A jumbled transmission, weak but insistent. Terrain worked her technical wizardry, boosting the signal and clearing the static. Is anyone there? An escape pod. Terran markings. Picking up faint life signs. The voice was unfamiliar, accented. Not Maldorian. A surge of adrenaline cut through Atara's despair. Respond. Identify yourself. Rescue vessel. Designation Starlight Wanderer, independent salvage operation. We picked up your distress beacon, but what in the blazes happened out here? Looks like a full-scale war zone. Maldorians, Atara spat the name. Her mind was already whirling, seizing the lifeline they'd been thrown, however frail it might be. Listen carefully, you stumbled into the middle of something critical. Our ship, it's done for. But we have data, intel on a Maldorian attack that could devastate. Atara spilled the grim truth to the Starlight Wanderer, barely pausing for breath. The independent hauler's captain, a grizzled Kihari named Sorik, listened with increasing disbelief, his scaled brow furrowing in concern. While no friend to the Maldorian Empire, he was far from eager to get tangled in an interstellar conflict. An attack on Earth? Io as a doomsday weapon? He growled, shaking his massive head. That's extinction-level madness. The whole sector would feel the consequences. Exactly, Atara pressed. The Confederacy needs to be warned. Can you transmit our data to them? Every second counts. Sorik hesitated, the weight of the decision clear in his amber eyes. The Starlight Wanderer, while capable, was hardly built for outrunning Maldorian warships or breaking blockades. This wasn't a simple salvage run anymore, it was a potential suicide mission. Just when Atara thought the sliver of hope was fading, Sorik grunted and turned to his comm officer. Prep a burst transmission, highest encryption the Confederacy uses. If we're getting vaporized for this, we might as well make it count. Relief washed over Atara, quickly replaced by the cold reality of their next problem. Escape pods were only meant for short-term survival, not interstellar travel. They lacked both the supplies and the FTL capabilities to reach a Terran outpost on their own. Captain Sorik, we appreciate the transmission, but we'll need your help, Atara said, keeping her voice steady. My crew, we need transport. Sorik hesitated. The Starlight Wanderer wasn't a passenger ship. Cramming it full of refugees would jeopardize his own crew's chances of survival in the hostile Jovian system. Yet, a familiar spark flickered in his eyes. Perhaps it was Terran stubbornness rubbing off on him, or perhaps, deep down, the Kihari knew sometimes you had to stand and fight, even against impossible odds. Fine, he relented. But it's gonna be a tight squeeze. And don't expect a luxury cruise. Within cycles, a grim sort of order descended upon the battered ruins of the Archeon. The wounded were ferried first, followed by the remaining crew in shifts. Atara left the evacuation to Terrain and Dr. Nix, trusting her closest allies to get everyone off the dying ship safely. She had a different battle brewing in her head. Commander Zhen, she sought out the weapons engineer amidst the orchestrated chaos. Zhen was coated in grime and humming an off-key tune, a jarring display of calm as she cannibalized anything salvageable from the Archeon's ruined systems. Yo, Commander, Zhen greeted her, barely looking up from the twisted power conduits she was wrestling with. We're moving to cramped quarters, so figured I'd downsize our firepower options. I wasn't talking about weapons, Atara said, urgency in her voice. The Maldorians have us outgunned and outmatched. We need an edge, and it's not going to come from conventional tech. Zhen finally paused, a curious glint in her eye. So we're talking experimental? The really dangerous kind that makes the science geeks get all sweaty? Exactly the kind, Atara affirmed. When the Archeon was retrofitted, you remember the theoretical schematics they sent us. Zhen stopped humming, a thoughtful expression settling on her face. The stuff that was decades ahead of deployment? Unstable particle manipulation? Yeah, I remember the warnings on those files. Big enough boom to destabilize half the system if it goes sideways. It's our only hope, Atara stated. The Maldorians used unorthodox methods to get this far. We need to beat them at their own game. Think you can repurpose what's left on the Archeon, build something that can punch above our weight class? Build? Commander, I can barely keep a coffee maker running in this mess, Zhen scoffed, then a wicked grin spread across her face. But rig something insane that might work once before blowing us all to atoms? Now that's my kind of challenge. Hope, however volatile, flared in Atara's chest. The Starlight Wanderer trembled under the strain of its new cargo. The former salvage vessel was now an overcrowded, patchwork haven. Terran crew members squeezed into every available corner, sharing bunks with the Kihari crew in an uneasy but necessary truce. Atara had claimed an abandoned storage closet for herself, barely big enough to lie down in, but privacy was the least of her concerns. Nix and Zhen had commandeered the Starlight Wanderer's cargo hold, transforming it into a makeshift lab bristling with jury-rigged equipment and flashing warning lights. Atara left them to their volatile genius, knowing that their crazy contraption might be the difference between a fighting chance and certain annihilation. Sorik had laid out their best-case scenario. It was as tenuous as it was reckless. The Starlight Wanderer would drop out of FTL on the edge of the Maldorian blockade around Io, relying on its status as a neutral salvage vessel to bluff or bribe their way past any initial patrols. The Terrans would stay hidden, a desperate surprise stowed in the belly of the unassuming freighter.